Hello and welcome, it's Aaron here at the Battle of Preston Pans Museum for the 13th video update for the What If interactive wargame campaign. A warm welcome to all of our new followers. Great to have had new subscribers in the last few weeks, and we hope that we'll be able to give you a very action-packed report today because a lot has been happening in the late weeks of February and the beginning of March 1746. Let's get stuck in. Now, I left you with the pretty shocking news that the Jacobite army, which some of us had started to write off after its defeat at Wetherby, had in fact started to turn its fortunes around, and it made a dash down through into the southwest of Scotland and into the northwest of England, leaving the British forces that had now committed to the northern push scrambling to turn about and work out what it was up to. You can see the dotted blue line on the northwest of England side of the map there, coming down and looking like it was making a move towards Manchester. And you can see Cumberland's main army up at the top there, tracking down towards Newcastle at the same time. So the Jacobites have definitely got a head start. There are British cavalry units that are tracking them down. Thomas Fulk and most of the cavalry has cut across to Newcastle and is going to head down the main road ahead of Cumberland's army. But there are a couple of squadrons that are following directly in the Jacobite army's path too. So hopefully there will be eyes on the Jacobites very soon for our Redcoat team. Otherwise, it looks like this is a pretty desperate scramble. So much so, in fact, that our British team clearly realised that there was going to be no chance of winning the race by land. So they took the opportunity, once they'd reached Newcastle, to ship most of Cumberland's army down the northeast coast of England in the hope of getting ahead of the Jacobite army. The cavalry that were tracking the Jacobites were pretty surprised, though, to discover that from Manchester the Jacobite army split. This is already a pretty small army, just the surviving battalions from the Battle of Wetherby campaign. Nevertheless, they felt confident enough to divide one road going towards Derby, the other cutting across towards Chester. You'll notice down at the bottom, though, there are some reinforcements coming in to London, but this is still looking pretty dicey at the moment. A very small Jacobite army making a dash into the centre of England and possibly the north of Wales, and the British forces struggling to try and work out what exactly they might be intending to do. Now we're going to follow the branch that heads off towards Chester first. This was a force under Lord George Murray, which strikes out towards the walled city of Chester, makes a summons, but as it had at Carlisle, once it's clear that the locals aren't going to open the gates, the Jacobites simply march on. The Jacobite column does not have any cavalry or any artillery. So it heads on into North Wales and it moves towards Wrexham. And then over the course of the next few weeks, we have some pretty complex and interesting events that take place in this small North Welsh town. I'm cutting a slightly longer story short here in order to fit everything into the update today. But essentially what happens is this. Lieutenant Colonel Whitney, leading a squadron of dragoons in pursuit of the Jacobites along the road from Manchester to Chester and then on to Wrexham, stumbles into the town to find that it is held against him. With barricades across the streets and with snipers in the buildings, the dragoons are forced to withdraw. They have no real idea how many men are in the town. It could be the whole of Lord George Murray's column, could just be a rear guard. It's not at all clear. So Whitney rides back to Chester. He summons reinforcements in the form of the Liverpool Blues, and then a few days later moves back towards the town. But not wishing to risk either untrained militia nor his precious dragoons in the narrow defended streets, instead they form a loose cordon around the town. Intelligence starts to suggest that most of the Jacobites have moved on, so this is a small force, but it has considerable local sympathy, and that causes a lot of problems for the locals here. Now, this had been a trouble spot in 1715, considerable rioting and disorder, and it looks like pro-Jacobite, or at least anti-government feelings, seem to have been stirred up in Wrexham once again. And as the situation goes on, with Whitney not having the strength to try and force Wrexham, it becomes a magnet for local discontent. You can see there, so Watkin Williams Wynne, he assembles a regiment loyal to King James out of his tenants and neighbours, and he marches to the relief of those within the town. You can see him there in the centre of the image and his fine portrait on the left. This is some Jacobite recruitment at last, making up for the disappointment that they'd found in Manchester when nobody had joined the cause as might have been hoped. So we've got some Jacobites rising in North Wales. They haven't been able to defeat Witney and the cavalry and the militia, but they have been able to push them back to Chester. And Witney is keen for some reinforcements before he attempts to try and storm the barricades in this growing tense situation at Wrexham. Whilst this is going on, we're going to take a brief pause from the English campaign and head back into the north because there is still activity going on in Scotland itself. So let's catch up with what the Duke of Argyll has been doing since Cumberland's army turned about and headed back into England. It's pretty clear from the intelligence briefings that most of the Jacobites, if not all of the Jacobite forces in Scotland, have joined the dash south. So there doesn't seem to be much left by way of resistance. The last intelligence that had been received suggested that the Marquis of Tullibardine, the Jacobite Duke of Atholl, was still the centre of Jacobite government in Scotland, if you could call it that, and that he was based at Invergarry Castle by this point, his own castle at Blair being far too close to Argyll's force at Perth. So as Cumberland goes down into England, Argyll marches up initially to Aberdeen on the northeast coast, and he's preceded by a battalion that goes by sea. And then he does the same operation again, preceded by a battalion going by boat. He marches round the top of the country to secure Inverness. There he's able to survey what remains of Fort George, put a garrison back in place before heading down the Great Glen towards Fort Augustus's smoking ruins and then heading to Invergarry. And it's there that he prepares to confront the Marquis of Tullibardine. Now, Invergarry Castle has a very formidable position on the loch side, but it is not designed to hold large numbers of men, and Tullibardine, even if he wanted to, doesn't have them. And so Argyll is able to successfully secure the approaches to Invergarry Castle, to cut him off from any escape by the loch, and then to bring up a battery of guns to menace the castle walls. Now, these are enormously thick walls, and Argyll does not have an inexhaustible amount of powder, nor does he have an inexhaustible amount of men. But with so much of the Jacobite strength down in England, Tullibardine seems to have very little hope of relief. And so perhaps it's no surprise that after holding out as long as he could, just over a week, in front of Argyll's batteries, Tullibardine is forced to surrender. His own health is pretty poor, he's got no hope of relief, and it seems that this is the end of Jacobite pretences of government in Scotland in our campaign. Tullibardine taken prisoner, Argyll victorious and now unopposed. But of course, it takes time for news of these events to trickle down into England. In the meantime, there are other dramatic interventions taking place. Both sides are getting an injection of support from overseas. Time then to have a look at the campaign as it's unfolding in England. Our Jacobite forces in blue that had diverged at Manchester, they've now converged again, this time at Birmingham. Followed now only by a single squadron of dragoons, because Witney's been distracted in North Wales and is still trying to sort out the situation at Wrexham. So our Jacobite columns have rejoined. Then they were expected perhaps to make the dash across the Midlands in towards London. Luckily, Cumberland's forces have disembarked and have started moving down to Peterborough with the intention of moving down to Northampton to block that route. Other forces moving up from London towards Oxford, closing down the Jacobite options. But the Jacobites don't make a move towards the southeast. Instead, they continue down through Worcester and on towards Gloucester. What are they up to? George II's hand at this point in the campaign is considerably strengthened by the arrival of a large force of Hessian troops coming under the Prince of Hesse-Kassel himself, and the injection of very well-disciplined forces good 6 battalions of regular infantry with cavalry and artillery support moving into the south of England settles some of the fast-beating hearts as the campaign had moved dangerously close towards London. And although some of our players became increasingly frustrated by the fact that moving armies around was taking such a long time in winter, over such long distances, eventually the Hessian army is able to link with the Duke of Cumberland, who's come down from the north. So it looks like our pro-government forces are starting to stack up their numerical advantage and should be pretty confident in their ability to not only defend London now, but turn and destroy the Jacobite threat. But although Cumberland's forces sailing down the northeast of England had been disrupted and delayed by some contrary winds, those same conditions had allowed part of the French fleet to get out into the Channel long enough for transport vessels to be escorted across the Channel. The sudden resurgence of Jacobite fortunes, the penetration of another Jacobite army into the south of England means that the French have decided that now would be the time to capitalise on their alliance with the Jacobites, and it's worth a gamble of injecting some regular disciplined soldiers into the south of England. We see the French coming ashore on the beautiful beaches at what is now Bournemouth before cutting across and securing the harbour at Poole. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice there at the centre, Charles Edward Stuart himself. It's soon confirmed by intelligence that Charles lands with the French. He had, in fact, by good fortune, linked up in the north not only with Tullibardine, but those French frigates, you might remember from the last update, that had brought supplies and money across to the Jacobites. He took the desperate gamble, it seemed, of getting aboard and sailing to France to personally pressure King Louis into sending this expeditionary force across. This was a gamble by a Jacobite team. They suffered severe penalties in recruitment and consolidation by the prince leaving the country, but they gained a higher chance of actually forcing French intervention. And so here it is. Will Charles Edward be able to link this French force with the Jacobite forces coming down through towards Gloucester, and will they combined have the strength to overwhelm the concentrating forces loyal to George II? They initially move out of Poole and set up a perimeter area whilst they're trying to establish contact with the Duke of Perth and the Jacobite forces further north. Once they've done so, they send out those last few remaining French vessels that had taken shelter in Poole harbour. Most of the French ships, as soon as they had unloaded, had returned to the French coast before the Royal Navy was able to intercept them again. But a couple had to run into Poole, one frigate and a couple of transports. These now decided to break back out and head back over to France, maybe even to pick up some more troops. But they were intercepted by Royal Navy patrols who were in fact planning their own expedition to try and cut them out once it was clear that the French forces were moving away from the harbour itself. So we had a naval engagement in which the French frigate is successfully captured. And whilst that action's happening, the two French transports attempt to slip out. One of them manages to do so. The other runs itself aground on the sandy banks outside Poole. Nevertheless, this means that although only one of the three ships has escaped, it means word will reach France, confirming what the situation is in the south of England and confirming exactly what Charles Edward thinks he needs to bring this war to a successful conclusion. Whether the King of France will listen remains to be seen, of course. We're now into the beginning of March, and our Jacobite forces under the Duke of Perth are continuing. Now they will have heard that the French have successfully landed on the south coast. So too will their friends and silent supporters. So too will their enemies. Will the Jacobites be able to link up with those French forces? Will the French come north to meet them, or will they have to go south to meet the French? The government is still trying to work out if the Jacobites will suddenly lurch towards the capital, so they're having to be very wary. But the Jacobites, lacking cavalry, have a much less clear impression of the strength and disposition of the British forces than is the other way around. Let's move our attention then to Bristol, Britain's second city in 1746. Let's start over on the campaign map. You can see that Cumberland's army has got down to Oxford, linked up with the Prince of Hesse, and then they have moved down to Reading. There is a strategic reserve. There is still a force, mainly of the Guards, at London, but now Cumberland's main forces are united on the western side of London, blocking the road to the capital. There is a small force comprising several regiments of Marines and various militias gathered down around Southampton and Portsmouth because there was a fear that that French force might move out of Poole towards Portsmouth. But after setting up a ring there, the French in fact decide to head up towards Salisbury. Meanwhile, the Jacobite forces continue south from Gloucester and they head towards Bristol. Bristol, hugely important economically to the British state, of course. Now, 18th century map of Bristol here, a sprawling metropolis, but draw your attention to the top there. There is a significant hill backing down onto the city, and that Brandon's Hill has on it the remains of some old Civil War earthworks. That position there will become important to us in a moment. Now, a city as important of Bristol, perhaps unsurprisingly, has raised a militia in its own defence, led by the Earl of Berkeley, a guards officer who was determined to make a stand here, but he simply doesn't have the numbers to defend the whole of the city. A small group of gentlemen volunteers do rally to the cause, however, on hearing of the Jacobites' approach. So Berkeley is determined that he's not going to be driven out without a fight. He might at least be able to force some concessions from the Jacobites in terms of their good behaviour. In fact, he redigs the little earthwork fort at the top of Brandon Hill and establishes himself with the militia and the gentlemen volunteers on the top of that dominating position overlooking the town. It's not a position from which he can hope to protect the city, though. And sure enough, the Jacobites are able to occupy the city without any fear. This is a huge blow, especially economically, but also in terms of morale. For George II's government, a city this significant should have been able to be protected. It does trigger something of a political crisis. The Prime Minister resigns, although since his opponents can't raise an administration either, he comes back into post just a couple of days later. There are threats of a run on the bank. There are serious fears that the government is not able to defend the most important parts of its territory. And in fact, a regiment is raised locally by the Duke of Beaufort in King James's name. Does it feel like the momentum has started to shift back towards the Jacobites? Certainly, the Earl of Berkeley hopes that he'll be able to give a little bit of a sting in their occupation of Bristol and hold out long enough to upset them somehow. But the Jacobites lack the strength to risk an assault. They don't have the numbers to take that sort of gamble anymore. They don't have the artillery to attempt to dislodge him by force and fire either. So they're content simply to surround the hill and keep an eye on what Berkeley's doing. He is able to smuggle a few letters out to the government, letting them know what's happening at Bristol and that the Jacobite forces are still in place. But as more and more offers come in over time, offering him good terms for surrender, and once news reaches them of Beaufort's raising of local English support, many of those volunteers start to think twice about holding out as the tide may be turning. Eventually, Berkeley decides that he's done what his honour required of him. He has put up some resistance to the occupation of the city, and although it hasn't cost any lives, his honour is sufficiently satisfied, and when he's finally summoned once again, Berkeley surrenders the fort on Brandon Hill. Bristol is now in Jacobite hands securely. Quickly back to our campaign map then, I'll fill you in on the fact that the cavalry under Thomas Fulk had been moving down so that they would be able to detect any sudden movement towards Cumberland's forces. They have been able to detect, therefore, that it is not the Jacobites moving out of Bristol towards the French, but the French moving out of Poole towards the Jacobites. And so Cumberland is able to move all of his strength straight towards Bristol too. So we must surely be just days away from a major confrontation, a confrontation that will decide the outcome of this conflict, that will decide the future of this nation. Unless something very unexpected happens in the next few days, that battle cannot be far away. Our armies are getting very close to one another. So I expect it won't be too long before I bring you our next update, maybe the most important of the war so far. I hope you're going to join us then. Please continue to support the project. Join in with the conversations on Facebook if you'd like to. You can see the link down below. Please subscribe to the channel and enjoy all the rest of the content that we have on here, as well as our What If campaign. And I will see you very soon.